So hi everybody and welcome to the latest Q community update. We had our last call back in December of 2025. And so it's been just over a couple of months if my maths is correct, but there's an awful lot to get through. So we're going to move at some pace through today and hopefully still have some time for questions at the end. But if we don't get to your question on the way, apologies, and we'll try and follow up afterwards. So the agenda is much the same as usual. I'm talking through parts of the Q open source project, but then also talking a bit about something called Q Hub. Talked about before, but under a different name. So talk about that later on in the session today. Daniel, I'll hand over straight over to you on the release update side of things.
So in terms of the releases, since the last call, we've done 2 alphas. The first alpha was a couple of weeks ago. It included a lot of the performance work that we already talked about at the last community call, plus a bit more. 3 new standard library functions, lots of LSP work that Matthew will talk about. And then the second alpha, which was this morning, was meant to be yesterday, but it happens. It has a new experiment and as well as a new else clause in the language, which Marcel will talk about. 3 more standard library functions and even more LSP work, if you can believe it. So please try the latest alpha and report any issues you find, especially with the experiments that Marcel will talk about. And as a reminder, like a broken record, but if you're stuck on an older version for any of the reasons above, i.e. performance, regressions, or Go API breakages, please let us know because we want to be aware of those. As far as I'm aware, there's pretty much just one user that fits into this category these days. And we also have Unity where you can add your project, be it public or private, so that we can basically do early regression tests against your code before we make changes to the repo or language.
Yes, language and evaluator. So not in this alpha, but in the previous, there were some more incremental performance improvements. Some of them more than small, basically. So one big change that we started working on now is to reintroduce concurrency, because right now you cannot you couldn't use Q values concurrently all the time. Talk more about it later. Lots of bug fixes, including fixes to QFix. And because they're so last minute, it's one of the reasons also why we didn't promote, for example, explicit open, because we really want people to be able to, to have the fix work longer. There were some weird little bugs in fix where shadowing wasn't handled correctly with rewrites, for example. So experiments, we still have, as a result, the alias v2 and the explicit open experiments ongoing. And then we have 2 new experiments, or really 1 new experiment. It's for try. I will elaborate on that more. This proposal was there for a very long time, but we finally implemented it. And then there are some upcoming experiments. So you would think that would be easier to do, that we maybe should have done it earlier, which is built-ins to replace the use of button, but actually try was a lot easier to do. And I'll get back to that later. So for the concurrency, so we think we fixed all the bugs now. So really, please try using, if you want to depend on concurrency, try to use it concurrently. We have not removed the guards for some of the libraries that could be concurrent, but right now are not, like ToolsFlow. But we hope to do that soon. And then, sort of in parallel to that, or somewhat related to it, not really, but somewhat. We also want to remove the limitation that you cannot unify 2 Q values that come from different Q contexts. So even if the contexts have different sets of functions, which Roger will elaborate on later, you should still be able to unify them. And right now, there's a hard limit. One reason is that we have different like that you want to memory manage and limit the key space because that's optimized, it's unique. But right now we have a single key space anyway, and with Go's weak pointers, there's a way to optimize that. So there's really no need to have that limitation. So that's another limitation we want to get rid of. So try. So this is basically how things look before and after try. So for example, right now, if you want to compare to bottom, and you see if A exists or if it has any error, then you would write it like this in the new with the new queue. With if the try experiment is enabled, you can just write it as you see on the right-hand side. So basically, if you have any reference within try, within the scope of try, that can be nested too. If you have a nested try, then that's its own try, and that's excluded. But basically, anything within the scope of try, if you have a reference with a question mark, if that question mark, if that reference turns out to not exist, like in this case, then the whole try block in its entirety is dropped, basically. Regardless if there's any other errors. It's quite simple in the end. The implementation turned out to be really simple. So why are we doing try? So if you look at another way to write that is on the left-hand side. So if you use a disjunction with a default value and you have foo index with a.b, and if there is an error, there's a fallback. So really the problem is if you really say only B cannot be there, or only A cannot be there, for example, and you write it like this, that if there is any error anywhere, you would still get fallback, right? So this turned out to be really brittle, was hiding errors and just not great. So how would you then write it instead? Well, you could write it as you see on the right-hand side, right? You say a.b. If it's not error, then foo a.b. But now you still have the problem that, that A might not exist, and then you're still getting back into that error, right? So let's say that only A is known to be valid. Well, then there's another problem, because now you cannot just check all the individual references, because ampersand is, like they all get evaluated at the same time. Maybe we should change that semantics too, but it's not shell semantics, right? So you now have to be really careful that you're evaluating them in the right order, and that you split them out over if expressions, right? So it's really not easy to get that right. It gets quite messy. So then, I don't know why this still exists. So this was, think of this as comparing to bottom, right? So really what you have, if you have this, you can now write it as you can see on the right-hand side with try, right? So you can say only A has to be there. So if A doesn't exist, it fails, right? But any of these other things can be optional. So this is much less brilliant. In practice, actually, it's much easier to write many of these things also. And it will get rid of a lot of the comparison against bottoms already. So you can see also maybe here why we didn't do exists first. Because basically if you're saying, well, so what does exist even mean, right? Like if you say it's only the last, sort of the last reference, right, which is not always clear, then you would still have to write it like this, and it still gets complicated. And then if you're going to say, well, what if you do the question marks? Well, that's in this case a little bit, then try is actually easier to define it than if you do it within a built-in, right? Because why in some built-ins and not in others, so it becomes a little bit murky. And with try, the scope is very easy to define. So that's why we did try first. So with try comes else. So else is another thing. So there's a lot of resistance from me for else for a very long time. And really there's two reasons for that. First of all, we don't have conditional expressions in Q, right? If it's not a conditional expression, it's a comprehension. So actually, something was funny apparently. So if it's not a conditional expression, it's a comprehension, and there it's harder to define what else would mean. But also the idea is like if you get a lot of nested if then else's, right? Like it gets very ugly, and that's not how configuration should look. So this was sort of forcing you to not do that. But in practice, it just gets ugly anyway. And actually looking at a lot of configuration code from other languages where they do have else, even though you can write very messy code, I've seen, let's say, very large code bases where people actually do have the discipline, and you hardly see misuse of it at all. So it's like, okay, it's apparently not that hard to keep that discipline, so might as well have the else. So then if you see this written here, right, like you can now then write it like this, which obviously looks nicer. So for now, because these are comprehensions, we don't have an else if yet. Of course, you can do it with curly braces, right? But we don't have that yet. So there's no chaining. So we sort of wanted to look at the non-disputed parts, coming back to that. And also the question is if you get into long chaining, wouldn't be a switch or a match operator, wouldn't that be better and more general, right? So it's actually what we've implemented now. It's quite trivial. It's a small language change, I would say, but else if would be quite substantial. So that's strangely enough. I see a question from Stephen.
I'll try to be brief. Can you just clarify, Marcel? You said it's not a conditional, it's a comprehension. What's the essential difference here?
So to the user, if you look at it, it doesn't look very different, but there is not an if then else clause in Q, right? It's basically so it's all sequence. So if you have like a bunch of ifs, it's not a nested expression, it's just a sequence of comprehension clauses. And then basically the last curly brace in a comprehension is a separate thing. So basically the if clause in a comprehension is just if condition. It doesn't have a body, right? And for if then else, you would need a body basically, and it doesn't have one. So you will basically have to introduce a new type of if within Q in order to implement this. And then to the user, you wouldn't really see the difference, right? But it is a different implementation basically. So that's the thing. Yeah. So the other nice thing is that this would also work for. So we did actually, we did change our minds a little bit, or I changed my mind, or we, whatever. So this is a bit weird to have for else. It's incredibly useful. You see it in some languages that are like that generate like templating generation and stuff like that, where, you know, with Q with configuration, it's a little bit the same thing. It's a very useful thing to have. So Python has for else, where it's a little bit different. However, this does limit the extension into if else later. So even though this is checked in before we have a final release, we will change the else for to like a different keyword like fallback, because down the line the semantics will be slightly different for else and fallback. So it just keeps the options open and will be clearer. And most importantly of all, if right now, if you have this else within this comprehension chain, even if we can have this more elaborate functionality or semantics later, it just reads really, really weird, right? Because if you have this list here and you have this for with the else at the end, if for doesn't produce anything, there's only one element that it will produce, right? Whereas if you like unindent the if and you put the else on a new line, right? This is how you could write it. Then I think most people would expect here to see two fallbacks within the list, not one, right? So in order to avoid that ambiguity, we say like, no, we just call it a whole different keyword, right? And then there will be no ambiguity there, basically. So that's the so technically correct, but just very confusing. So that's one thing that will that's actually already implemented in the meantime, but not in the current release. So other evaluation work. So there are a few outstanding bugs in V3 that are holdover of V2, and most of them are related with the way comprehensions are implemented. So we're basically, so I mentioned eval v4 before. So Evil v4 very much hinges also on this different representation of comprehensions. You cannot implement the v4 without it. But arguably, we're getting a lot of the benefits just doing the comprehension. So now we're doing a v3 re-implement of just the comprehensions. Like before, we did a small Q hub stint. I started working on it. It's actually in a pretty advanced stage already, so hopefully it won't be too much work to finish that. And that will address some big outstanding bugs that were there for a while already. Then after that, so that might also have some performance implications, by the way. So there are some pathological cases. If you have like nested comprehensions where there's a lot of failures, we might end up recomputing it a lot. So that would then also be eliminated with that change. But there's still the holy grail, like massive expected speed up, fine-grained structure sharing, which has kept being delayed, but the time is ready after the comprehension work to start working on that. That should really have very large performance gains in many cases, I'd say. Yeah, Daniel.
Yep. So last time I did a few slides in the evaluator section, it was about performance, and this time it's about bug fixes. So for some context, slightly before Christmas, we were already hitting 1,000 open issues, which is not really like a bad thing per se, but it was a milestone of like, maybe we should do something about the issue tracker growing a little bit out of control. So as of today, we're down to 877 open issues. A lot of these were fixes going straight to master for minor bugs or panics or hangs or regressions from Evaluator and things like that. Over a dozen of them had been fixed over the last 2-3 years since each one of these was filed, and multiple others were invalid in some way, like duplicates. So I want to say this out loud. If you have filed issues in the last few years, and you can take 10 minutes to try the latest alpha and just double check whether your issues are still valid today, that would be useful, because it could be that maybe the reproducer no longer works and maybe your original code still panics. That can happen sometimes. Or maybe it has been fixed in the meantime. Or maybe the language has evolved in a way where your user request should be a little bit different these days. And I'll also briefly mention that we have started using AI to help with this a little bit. And I will emphasize that it has been really helpful with the tedious part of dealing with all of these issues, especially bug reports. Because if you think through the amount of time that I used to spend dealing with bug reports, the vast majority was before we look at a fix, right? The typical example is somebody says, hey, I have this Q project and it doesn't do what I expect. And the number of lines that I'm looking at initially to have a reproducer is likely in the thousands of lines, be it Q or Go. So at least the Claude code models have gotten to the point where I can literally just point it at the bug report and it can reproduce it locally. It can do the reduction by itself, which was easily the part that melted my brain the most. It's not difficult per se, it's just very tedious. And it can also see our existing test suite and figure out how to write a regression test. Two key aspects that I think allow it to do all of this by itself with very little human help is that we have pretty good structure in terms of the bug reports. So that means we have a bug report template that has, this is what I did, this is what I expected, this is what I got, this is the Q version, extra information, and so on. And also test scripts. Because even though these AI agents like writing a lot of bash, they seem to do an okay job at reading a test script file with, commands at the top, some comments, and then files at the bottom. They can understand what's going on pretty quickly. And the other aspect that makes the model work pretty well is the fact that, at least with bug fixes, the North Star is pretty clear, and it's just a binary. Does this panic still occur? Is the output the expected output? Things like that. So that allows us to, for example, do the reduction without a human getting in the way of like, no, this is the right path or the wrong path. And I'll also briefly mention that I believe Paul is working on a blog post to expand on this a little bit.
Yeah, I think we've got a blog post in the making for the benefits of that we're seeing from sort of adding tools like AI to the workflow, whether it be in the open source project or elsewhere. So look forward to sharing a bit more details on that, but thanks for the update on that, Daniel. Roger, I think you're going to talk us through some new proposals and features.
Yeah, so let me move on. So there's a couple of features I wanted to talk about. One's been something we've wanted for a long time, but weren't quite sure exactly what to do, which is like having FS support, like essentially custom file system support in queue load, because that means that you can. Currently, there's an overlay FS which is phrased with respect to the underlying operating system file system. But that's not ideal in a bunch of ways. So this guy Peter Skripal, I don't know if you're here, but thank you very much. Anyway, he made a PR, which is great as a kind of crystallization. I could look at that and say, well, actually, I think this could be a bit simpler. This isn't quite what we want, but it's still a very good stepping point towards what we want. So I looked at that. I've made a proposal which isn't quite haven't quite landed yet, but there's for what the actual semantics is going to be, and yeah, I've got a work in progress implementation that seems to work. There's an interesting aspect actually which pertains to queue, a lot of queue in general actually, is that if you want to present an error and the source isn't actually in a file, what do you actually do about that? Because you're maybe getting an error, a conflict from somewhere in some server or other, and you can't actually see the file that the queue is in. So I kind of, in a way, there's no right answer to that, but in this case, I think that the right answer is just let the user configure how to map from that file system path to the error, to what's going to be presented to the user in the error. And then, so for example, if you know that your files are accessible in some HTTP address, your errors can reflect that. Another thing that we're quite close to actually having a proper proposal and not far off an implementation for is the ability to plug custom functions into the queue evaluator. So the idea is that you should be able to plug your own hermetic functions. There's no guarantees about how many times they might be called. We assume no side effects. There's no sort of model for side effects. That kind of thing could potentially come later. And that with respect to the queue package, you'll be able to take a Go function and essentially provide it to as something that is callable within queue. And so there's kind of three stages for that. One is to provide the ability to provide your own Go function and turn that into a queue value that's then callable, and then something which allows you to say, given a particular import, give me you can provide a package that's going to be returned from that, which can have your own Go functions in, if you like, or your own functions in. So that means that you'll be able to have an import that calls your own custom functions, and then sort of the next stage is like, well, actually, if people have their own custom functions, their own custom things, well, actually, you want that to be callable from a queue as well, the queue binary, the queue command line, and so there's the possibility, and we don't know, this is all very hand wavy as yet, to build your own custom queue binary with some of these custom functions in, yeah, proposal to follow soon. And just as a kind of taster, this is the kind of code that I'm imagining might work at the sort of low level. So here you've got a queue context. You're making a new queue context which is associated with these things. You provide a loader which is invoked when something's imported. And here you go, we're creating a Go function, a queue function, and returning the value for that package. And it's actually quite that kind of mechanism is quite general and quite potentially useful for other things too. So that would be unified in with the package and any other. So you can potentially use that to annotate or expand other packages too. So that's the general idea, but it's work in progress.
Thanks, Rog. As Rog said, we're going to share the links to those proposals. The IOFS one is very nearly cooked, and then the custom functions one will follow at a slightly later/soon date. Moving on to modules in the Central Registry, keeping half an eye on the time, we're not doing too badly. Just as a brief reminder, the Central Registry, and we'll talk about this a bit more later on in the context of a couple of use cases, is designed to act as a well-known place for not necessarily well-known schemas, but just for people to share modules, and that module, Q module, being the unit of reuse between Q projects. It's domain name-based namespace. You can publish your own modules, just as long as you can control the namespace. We have a set of curated schemas to sort of light your enthusiasm for consuming modules, and they're published on QDive docs. Just as a quick reminder, you can publish, this question came up recently, just serves as a nice reminder, you can publish modules under a vanity domain, as it's called in the Go ecosystem. So for example, as you saw on the previous slide there, we publish some curated modules, and they exist under the q.dev namespace. And the way that works, as you can see, is on q.dev, we have a well-known endpoint that actually serves up some JSON that tells the Central Registry, if it sees a q.dev namespace module, where it should ultimately look for the auth related information, because the Central Registry is currently GitHub auth based only. So you can see here in this situation, that endpoint returns something that says it's of type GitHub, and then points at the repo itself that defines the permissions fundamentally for the related modules in that namespace. Another thing we've worked on since last time is OIDC auth against the Central Registry from GitHub Actions. Now the use case here is, and we have this in many of our own repos, where we either want to fetch private modules and or publish modules from or to the Central Registry from a GitHub Actions workflow. Having to inject some sort of token as a secret into any of those workflows is tedious at best, error prone, and much more likely to get things wrong. And also when there are compromises in some way, shape, or form, it's a harder nut to crack. OIDC in this respect is a really nice alternative to auth, and has a very clean model for effectively being sort of a signed-based approach to a GitHub Actions workflow, saying this is the workflow that I'm in here, this is who I am, this is the workflow, this is the repo, please can you give me some auth? And so this is how it works. If you want to, from within such a workflow, say just log into the Central Registry, that's all you need to do, absolutely no auth tokens required. And then on the other side of that, what you end up doing is configuring some settings within the Central Registry itself to say which repositories are enabled for this, and essentially whether you want to limit it by workflow or branch or anything like that. And then if there is a match as far as that's concerned, then the Central Registry replies to your GitHub Actions workflow saying, yep, sure, and here is your auth token, and then you're authorized from that point onwards. You can also delegate to another user if you don't want your own credentials. So for example, in our GitHub Actions workflows, we delegate to a bot account because we don't want to have high privilege execution against the Central Registry within our workflows. We actually want to sort of de-escalate those. And so all of this is possible. If you just head over to registry.q.work/account/OIDC, you'll be able to see the configuration of that endpoint for yourselves. Any issues or feedback on the Central Registry, please let us know. The OIDC feedback was one that we've had from a few folks, and actually we're just going to be publishing a few more docs on auth in particular. But otherwise, I think that's it on the Central Registry side of things. So I'll hand over to Matthew for the QLSP side.
Thank you. Yes, some updates on the LSP side. So I think last time we did a community call, 0.15 was already out, and that included support for basic LSP features, structure definition, find references, etc. There were some known problems with completions, in that the initial somewhat naive implementation would only provide completions if there was already a stem to work with. You had to have something that was sort of non-white space, and it would predict from there onwards. So that has now been completely rewritten. It's not perfect. We're aware of some bug reports on it, and I will be working on that. Hopefully it will be polished by the time 16 comes out in its final form. But it's a lot better, and it does allow for the normal sort of IntelliSense. You can ask for completions from within the middle of white space. Some error diagnostics already appeared. That's not super useful. It's useful in some cases, but it's mainly only getting error diagnostics from the parser. So yeah, it doesn't tell you, for example, that something's wrong if you're trying to add a string to an int. It's more sort of syntax errors at this point. Document symbols has also arrived. A lot of editors will use that to provide a sort of breadcrumb style ability to navigate through the file, which can be useful for huge files. I know some of you are working on absolutely enormous queue configurations. There have also been an awful lot of bug fixes, sort of far too many to go into the details of. But everything from there were some mistakes when processing files which had got spaces in the file name, right through to some errors in jumped definition and yeah, how certain fields were being handled. There have been lots of bug fixes all over the shop. One of the main new features that has just appeared is support for editing embedded files. This is on master. So you can go and try it out, and it did make it into the alpha that got released today. But there are problems with, for example, YAML support at the moment. That will be being fixed very, very soon. So initially, it only really works with embedded JSON. So if you're using the embed attribute and you're using that to embed a JSON file, internally, we're treating the embedded file as if it's an imported package. So think of it equivalent to a sort of upstream imported package. Now, there is some special treatment of that so that we're doing completions, suggestions in both directions. So that means that if I was on the left-hand side here in my queue file, and I had my cursor after the age field, and I asked for completions, then I would see breathing to be suggested. And it works in the opposite direction as well. So if I was over in the JSON file and I was asking for suggestions for field names, then I would see age being suggested. So that does work in both directions, which is a very special treatment. We don't normally do this for normally embedded, normally imported packages. It's not just completions, it does also work for hoverdocs. At least when you're in the JSON, it will suggest documentation coming from the queue. It does work for embedding files, as this example. It does also work with globs, although there are limitations for globs. I have done a little video on dealing with embedded files, which talks about, towards the end of it, it's only 8 minutes long, I think, it talks about some of those limitations for globs and suggests some things that we're probably going to implement in order to make that experience a little bit better. So from now until 16 comes out, it's mainly going to be sort of bug fixing and sorting out some of these rough edges. There is a getting started guide, which hasn't been updated in a little bit of time. I need to do that tomorrow. There's a longer form talk where I give lots of examples and discuss the LSP more generally. And I'm always around on the Discord and Slack channel, LSP channels. Thank you to everyone who has been filing bugs. It's extremely useful, and please keep them coming.
Excellent, thank you. Does the one question from me, does the breadcrumb support work within embedded JSON and the like? I'm guessing it probably would.
It would, yeah, it would. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention there are a couple of code actions as well. People asked for a code action to be able to go from sort of A:, B:, C to A:, open braces. Those have appeared as well, and they are in the alpha. Sorry, I forgot to mention those.
I think it slipped everybody's minds when we were reviewing the slides earlier on. We'll make sure the slides include links to those because those code actions have been regularly requested. Thanks again to folks who have been, again, making suggestions on things where we should prioritize. The release notes have the info. Perfect. Thank you, Daniel. Moving on to talk about QHub. This is a name, QHub is a name we've actually been using internally for a number of years. We called it the configuration control plane before, on the basis that we thought that control plane sounded a bit more of an appropriate name, but it just turned out to be something of a mouthful. So we've actually just returned to using QHub. And we were at config management camp back at, goodness, it was only at the beginning of the month. It feels like it was months ago already, but it was only 20 days ago. And Marcel and I gave a talk that was titled Beyond Static Files, Dynamic Configurations for a Future-Proof World, which, talking about mouthfuls, that's quite a mouthful of a title, let's be honest. The premise of the talk was that the core problem that we're facing... Sorry?
It fits on the line, so it's okay.
The premise of the talk was that the core problem we are dealing with is that outages are caused by configuration complexity, and we talked in a bit more detail about how and where that complexity comes from. And the solution where Q as a foundation to dealing with that complexity, and then introducing Q Hub with a demo, as just a reminder, that's the new name, improved name for the configuration control plane, and sharing a bit of the details of the roadmap of where we're actually heading with Q Hub. There's a link to the live talk that we gave there from the config management folks. Thanks very much to them for hosting. It was an excellent conference. As I said, we did in the talk explore why configuration is so complex and the things that sort of feed into that. Sort of identifying from a high level, not just sort of, I think at times we tend to perhaps overly focus on the actual sort of technicalities of the language, but this was a good opportunity for us to step back and think about and communicate, well, how and where does complexity actually come from? It's sort of in sort of very loose terms here, because this is clearly not a mathematical equation with those images in there. And not just that, is that what sort of additional friction is there on top of that complexity, as it were, or contributing to that complexity, where we as humans are involved in the configuration process as well. So this was the premise, as we said, where we have Q as the foundation for dealing with these. So the sort of, dare I say, the mathematical logical foundations of Q are a key part of unraveling a lot of that complexity. But as we talked about in the launch event with Kelsey when talking about the configuration control plane, that only takes you so far. So only certain folks will be comfortable and happy stitching together open source tools to actually build a configuration management platform themselves. This is where Q Hub, as sort of that layer on top of Q, comes in sort of living and breathing all of those key principles of Q itself, but then actually providing that operational, real-life, production-ready tool for you to actually manage configuration on a day-to-day basis, whatever tooling it is you might be using. So this diagram sort of covers many and all sort of aspects of sort of inputs or sources on the left-hand side, and things hanging off the right-hand side, whether we want to call those sinks or otherwise. So we talked about this at a config management camp, and we gave a short demo, a demo that we'll be embellishing on more at KubeCon at the end of March. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on. The demo was essentially focused around having a couple of sources and then actually open tofu off the right-hand side being that system of implementation. And so when we talk about this more and share more details over the next month or so, it'll be more about, okay, well, how and where can we plug in different types of sources and then have different sinks off the right-hand side, or whatever name we want to, whatever name we arrive on. And then what kind of operational benefit do folks actually get from having Q Hub in the middle there? And we had some great conversations at Config Management Camp about what it is that people would want to see from Q Hub. So thanks to those folks who popped along to see us. There is a long list, and we talked about a number of these with folks who dropped by to talk about where Q Hub could or should go. Number of folks saying, please just focus on the CLI. Others saying, actually having some sort of UI to visualize this is just as important. Matthew hinted at this earlier on, but didn't say it explicitly. Things like LSP integration is an absolute classic use case of trying to shift things left and find out problems earlier. So Matthew was talking about the fact that the LSP only for now provides parser-related errors. There's absolutely nothing at all to suggest that the LSP couldn't connect to something like Q Hub and actually provide that sort of even earlier feedback of problems with what it is you're writing. Talked about different sorts of integrations, richer support for downstream systems, reporting back state and observations. So sort of a key tool, Q Hub then sort of being like a key tool from like an observability perspective. Audit trails, analysis, that kind of compliance function, that really resonated very strongly with folks at Config Management Camp. QHub as a registry, if you squint really hard, of course, you might consider the QHub to be a replacement in some respects for the Central Registry or a key registry in some respects. And then everything these days has to mention AI. So at the bottom there, let's just include MCP integration at the bottom as well. I'm being slightly playful. There's many ways in which QHub can be supported by and or support things in the wide AI space. If any of these configuration problems sound familiar, please just get in touch with us. We had a number of great conversations at Config Management Camp. We're going to be having more such conversations between now and KubeCon. Well, we are going to be at KubeCon, but if in the meantime you want to get in touch, please do. We'd love to have a chat. Today, we also released a blog post that sort of riffs off the back of this presentation we gave at Config Management Camp. What is configuration anyway, and why is it so hard? It's really this much higher level overview from our perspective of what configuration actually is, because speak to 100 people, and I don't want to say you would get 100 different definitions of what configuration is. It wouldn't be far off. And so at the same time, we're just trying to tease out what the common aspects of those definitions are and how to actually manage what we consider to be configuration complexity. I think that's it on that side of things. So to sort of riff straight into the community updates. Apologies, the first of these is a project that landed. There was an announcement of it last week in Slack. Thank you to Ryan for posting. We haven't actually spoken to Ryan yet, nor have we actually had a chance to dig into this in full detail. So I'm posting this somewhat blind to having looked at the project. This is powered by Q and a policy as code approach. We look forward to speaking to Ryan, and if any other folks have any experience using it, please shout. Eddie Knight and Jen Power have been doing some fantastic work on the Jamara project, part of OpenSSF. Looking to use Q as a validation layer. They have published a schema to the Central Registry, links there to the actual project itself. Again, this is sort of more of a compliance type model, where it's in the kind of policy space. And so please just take a look at their project there. Eddie and Jen have done a fantastic job at helping actually iron out a couple of bugs on the Central Registry side of things as well. So thanks again to them for helping to dog food on that side of things. I think we've mentioned this before, but definitely worth mentioning the Perseus project we mentioned a long time ago from memory. Antoine and team have been building a fantastic project here in that is an alternative to, brain is totally failing me, excuse me, a dashboard from an observability perspective. A very rich ecosystem that is, again, Q-based from the plugin perspective. They are also publishing these plugins through the Central Registry and using that as the means of actually distributing plugins for Perseus itself. So please check out that project as well. Just to mention, a friend of Q, Roman Mazur, who was at Config Management Camp as well, gave a wonderful talk about expectations-driven development, using essentially models that are sketched out in Q to drive what it is that your system should do, and then using that to refine effectively what you're actually deploying in terms of infrastructure. So really fascinating talk and a great fun talk, because there was much more audience participation than you would imagine from a talk that is in this space. So really great talk. The link is there to the YouTube video. I strongly encourage watching that, but also the code on the polling side of things is worth taking a look at as well. This last weekend, I finally broke and started working out, trying to answer the question of how Q and Helm could perhaps better play side by side. It's one of the most common questions we ask of, we use Helm heavily, how can we use Q? The migration path between the two is not straightforward, and we've mentioned before and linked to work that Stefan Prodan has done with Timoni as an alternative to Helm. This is based in the Q ecosystem. This is not an attempt to answer that same question. It's instead an attempt to try and tackle the problem from a different perspective. If somebody has a load of Helm charts and or actually more generally has a whole load of text template, how can you potentially migrate from that to Q? So this is a first principles attempt to actually try and convert a text template based system, of which Helm is just one, into something that is queue-based. Then looking at how the systems like Helm and others also tackle things like defaults and trying to understand more about those ecosystems and therefore what it would look like to help folks migrate and or sort of perhaps validate existing systems using queue. I did not manage to make that repo public before today. Apologies, I will make it public before the end of the week and then spam everybody in Discord and Slack accordingly. Dominic, keep going.
Yes. Well, we had a lot of fun at Config Management Camp, and we also learned a lot. And now we're already preparing the next conference we're going to. It will be KubeCon Amsterdam. We will be there with the booth. It's in the Hall 5. It's a little bit at the eating area. I'm pretty sure we'll find us. We will wear our pink shirts and they will stand out. Please drop by. Let's talk about configuration. Let's talk about Q. Have a look at the QHub demo. Maybe grab some merch. If you're around, just let us know that we can look out for you. If you know about any company that's around that might use Q, happy to talk to them as well. Yeah, just give us a quick hint. And then on top of this, we're always open to talk about Q, maybe about your use cases. You have seen Paul presented some very exciting Q-based projects or projects using Q. So if you're building anything with Q, get in contact. We're always happy to have a look and maybe help, maybe write together something about your use case. And as Daniel already mentioned, lots of Q users are already now on Unity, getting a lot of value out of it and making it a lot easier to upgrade to newer versions of Q. So if you're not yet on Unity, yeah, let's reach out. We can talk about this. It is quite efficient to use if you want to upgrade.
I was going to say that Unity is something that is definitely, we've talked about it before, but helping to tighten that loop on creating fixes. Daniel talked about the way in which we're able to take large reductions, use AI for sort of a lot of the grunt work behind that, but having Unity in there as that very early check on have we fixed this, have we broken it, is absolutely essential. So thanks to those folks who are helping to tighten things up on that side. Unbelievably, I think we have actually finished with 10 minutes to spare. That is something of a record, which does leave time for some questions, if anybody has any after that whirlwind update. I can't see who that is, but please go ahead. Is it Tony?
Tony.
Yeah, it's Tony. On the back on if stuff, I forget which one, or try. I think it was try. I'm just curious, can I do a list of tries, a list comprehension? Yeah, like we have the mock, yeah, right in there. We have like, this one probably is good, right? Go back to that slide.
This one,
like we got a switch statement there on the left, more or less. Could I just replace that first on the left where that if statement is? Can I just replace it with a try block without an else? Will that work?
Yep.
Because that could just simplify a bunch of like cases in that. Because if I still have 3 or 4 cases I need to cover, the try still would be really nice. So then if each entry is a try, it kind of acts like an F, just cleaner.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome.
It wasn't particularly encouraged earlier on, but please just use Slack, Discord with links to the playground tip. We should have made this clear. tip.qlang.org/play does work with all this latest stuff because it is working with, unsurprisingly, the tip of Q. You do have to enable the experiments. So hacking on this stuff in the playground is highly encouraged, and sort of sharing ideas and or things that, as Marcel suggested earlier on, if you write something and you think this should work from my perspective and it doesn't, that kind of feedback is also really, really useful. As in, I heard what you said, I tried this, and no pun intended, I tried this and it didn't work.
You need the experiment. Yeah, this is the experiment attribute to try it.
Yes, trying of try is very much encouraged.
Sorry, trying.
Oh, goodness. Quick, someone ask another question. Tom, go for it. I think you were first.
Yeah, maybe it's like off topic from anything discussed today, and I'm very excited about everything you've already shared. But I'm curious about, like, last year there was some talk about the workflow engine of Q and where that's going. I know there's been a lot of distraction improving Q in other ways, but I'm curious where that discussion sits for this year.
Yeah.
Sorry, Marcel, I'll let you answer first.
Yeah, so for this, I mean, it's still very much maybe not top of mind, but still very much like high priority. We just had some other things to do first, I would say, right? But it is together with the function proposal. I mean, it really centers around having very precise definitions of what a function is within Q, right? And then once you have that, the whole workflow thing becomes quite trivial. But yeah, having a good ecosystem, having a good way to share the schemas, the built-ins are sort of necessary for that, right? So the work that Roger is doing. So there's a lot of, like small little steps that we're doing that's building towards that. But I think, for example, also from a QLabs perspective, right? I think having these workflows will be quite a killer app, right? Like I think a lot of people will use this. So I've experimented also a bit with code generation, right? Like, because I actually needed scripts, and generating scripts with AI is a nightmare, right? Because it's either hard to read if it's Bash, or it's like huge if it's Go. And if you actually using this new model, right? Because you can generate it if it doesn't exist yet. If you explain it and give some examples, the generation is really nice, right? It's much nicer than anything else out there. So it would definitely be, I think, a good thing to have. Yeah.
I'll just briefly add a couple of points there. I think there's a mea culpa necessary on this in terms of not having provided an update on the discussion we started on this. There was a huge amount of great exchanges on the workflow side of things, and as Marcel is suggesting, basically this actually sort of gave rise to these sorts of fundamental questions of, okay, where exactly do functions fit into it? And what we haven't done is communicated back, right, we need to sort of slightly pause on things for a second whilst we understand these fundamental questions here, and or deal with things like the evaluator at the same time, because fundamentally one of the key problems with Q command at the moment, or tools flow, is the evaluation cost, and the massively, you can get very, very quickly into situations where you explode in terms of evaluation. So it's not at all to say that we've put things on hold permanently, far from it. We, as Marcel said, we've just not done very well at communicating, and I will take responsibility for that, the things that we needed to work on first in terms of priority order. It's a brilliant question. Marcel hinted at as well the fact that in sort of any system, whether it be QHub, but just generally this concept of workflows and firing off work is something that is just entirely common. You could sort of look at GitHub Actions in the same way. Any sort of runner scenario where you are looking to get some work done, either in a sort of fire and forget way and or sort of in a long running process way. And this all came sort of nicely to a head, as it were, in the analysis we did on Q command and what V2 might look like. We're definitely piecing through all of that to just work out, okay, what changes do we need to make in the open source project to make it scalable and performant, but at the same time, and this is where the functions piece comes in, what is the right interface to have with the outside world? Where does that low level interface sit? And then where do higher level sort of composable building blocks sit from like reusable workflows? So thank you for the prompt, Tom. I will provide such an update, as it were, on the discussion so that we don't sort of leave that hanging. Thank you for the nudge. We did have another question. I can't quite see.
Nick.
Oh, Nick, thank you. I couldn't see the list of people.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I was just thinking through defaults myself to some degree. I'm wondering if the archetypes are essentially left-hand side default mechanisms. And then I'm also wondering how to use match in, possibly the try, like what is the required archetype like really supposed to be used for now that we have try? And it seems like some of my match ins plus a required archetype just doesn't work properly, but I'm still trying to get just lots of examples, you know, so.
Can you
Cool.
clarify what you mean with archetype for a moment?
Oh yeah, so like I thought that was the main word for like whether a field is required, optional, or just a member field.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so the question is how that fits in with defaults, or?
Yeah, like if it does, I'm not entirely sure. I've been kind of like having very, very sparse config where everything is optional.
Yeah.
And then trying to use match-in plus required schema to do a sort of unify accept. I don't know if those are the right words, but and then I'm wondering how does that kind of all change with try, and is required even like a good field type anymore? Like, should I be using the exclamation point or not?
Yeah, I mean, those are orthogonal concerns. You can even use in try, you can refer with the question mark, you can refer to required fields as well.
Okay.
So that all should interact. I mean, we have been looking at changing the default semantics, but there are some error cases that would be better with some changed defaults, but we just have to really be, you know, like watch out that we're not having like many that we're not going to get into this layer default situation, right? But that's a whole separate discussion. So I would say this is all quite orthogonal. So what's nice about try, what we could do in the future, I don't know if this is answering your question, but partly, but before, if you had like this comparison to button, there's no clarity about what the user intends, right? Like, whereas now within the try, if you have a reference within a try that is still optional, right? Like you know that there is a potential error situation there, right? So we can now have we haven't implemented it yet, but you can now have vet tools that check the consistency of the try block versus the code that's out there, and like you can be much more pedantic about and really do catch a lot of, you know, user errors quite nicely with this. But that doesn't answer your question around defaults, I think.
I was just going to say briefly on defaults, because I saw another comment come through earlier about defaults, and that jogged my mind again, is that we also spent some considerable time looking at defaults last year as well. Again, we probably need to do a better job of updating on that. We definitely haven't put that to bed, because it's firmly out of bed, if you like, defaults. And we don't know. It's more trying to wrap our hands around in that situation what defaults could and should look like. But as all the language changes that we're making here, they're in with a view to changing defaults potentially down the line, how they work. I mentioned layered defaults earlier on. That was just to clarify, because I think I saw someone saying layered defaults are evil. That was with reference to how other systems like Helm, for example, use defaults. And so that's not to say that that's the approach we're going to follow with Q, but it's an approach that, as someone who's considering moving to Q, you need to understand if someone's moving from a system of layered defaults, what does that actually look like? How do you manage that? And one of the interesting things that we've been exploring is that if you sort of building a layer on top of Q, a la Q Hub, and certainly not limited to that, is if you're building on top of Q, you can do sort of more, dare I say, like operational type things when it comes to things like defaults, as in you're not limited to pure language constructs, but you can still build on top of the principles that Q has without sort of pulling the rug out from people's feet. And so I think it's about trying to potentially, the view on defaults has shifted somewhat from we can do everything within the language to we want to do certain things within the language, but then we'll leave other things to other people and layers above that. But we have made no firm decisions on that at all. I saw another hand come up very briefly. Steve.
Yes. Can you nest tries? Does anything weird happen?
Yeah, you can. So basically the nested try, that becomes a new scope for the question mark. So only the question marks up to the point where a new try comes will count for that try. So it's all nicely scoped, and there's like tests in there to verify that. So.
And so a failure of an inner try does not automatically induce failure of a containing try, right?
Correct.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
I'm sure there'll be plenty of wrinkles that we'll try and work out over Slack and Discord over the next few days. Look forward to the tip.qlang.org links. Folks, it's been a wonderful call today. Thank you to everybody who joined. Sorry, we're going to need to wrap up fairly quickly today. Thanks again. Any questions, please ping us in Slack, Discord, or on GitHub. But speak soon. Thank you.